Hello, everyone. I'm Lucy Beednell with the ARC of Northern Virginia. We are so excited to bring you the fourth session today in our four-part series on the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. And today's focus is on looking at the whole ADA in plain language. So we'll be focused on language that should be more understandable and accessible to people, on how to use pictures to tell the story about how the ADA can be useful. And we'll work at giving some examples for you on the ADA in practice, so you can help wrap your head around how exactly the ADA could apply to your life. I would like to present our fantastic presenters. We have Anne Deschamps from Transcend, our Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, who is a tremendous ADA resource, and Donna Patchett, who's an ADA Leadership Fellow, who has really been helping to lead and write this presentation series. We couldn't be in better hands today. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and let them kick things off.
Thank you, Lucy. We're very happy to be here today in a safe place and providing this webinar for everybody. And I will say that the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center has been really happy to sponsor all four webinars in this series, and we hope to do more down the road as well. And we call this series simply the ADA, because that's what it is. So if you haven't had an opportunity, I encourage you to go back and listen to our first three webinars, which are available on the ARC of Northern Virginia's YouTube channel. But without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Donna.
Thank you, Anne. Next slide, please. We want to give you an overview of the Americans with Disabilities Act today. So what is the Americans with Disabilities Act? The Americans with Disabilities Act, also called the ADA, is a law. When people with disabilities are treated unfairly, it's called discrimination. The ADA protects people with disabilities from discrimination. Next slide, please.
Donna, can you tell us who is considered a person with a disability?
Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, a person with a disability is someone who has difficulty doing things that other people can do more easily. A disability can affect physical skills, such as walking, your senses, such as hearing or seeing, or intellectual skills, such as thinking or concentrating. Disabilities can affect communication skills.
So would this mean that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities would be considered people with disabilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act?
The ADA does not include a list of diagnoses or types of disabilities that are considered protected under the ADA. But people with intellectual and developmental disabilities often have difficulty doing some things other people can do. For example, maybe it is difficult for you to communicate or read or think or process information quickly. If you have difficulty doing any of those things, you would likely be considered a person with a disability under the ADA. Next slide.
Can you tell us about the different sections of the Americans with Disabilities Act?
Yes, the ADA has 5 sections. In the law, they're called titles. Titles mean sections or chapters. People with disabilities have the same rights as everyone else, and the ADA's 5 sections talk about those rights. Next slide, please.
So, Donna, can you explain what is a right?
That's a great question. It's a good starting place. A right is something a person has that people think should not be taken away. It's a rule about what a person is allowed to do or have. So for example, you have the right to go to school. You have the right to go to stores, restaurants, movie theaters. You have the right to vote. So people with disabilities have a right to have the same rights as anybody else. You will often hear people talk about the rights that Americans have under the Constitution. You have the right to free speech. You have the right to practice your religion. You have the right to gather in groups of people that have the same interests as you. People with disabilities have all of those same rights as any other citizen. Next slide, please. The first section or title of the ADA talks about employment. Next slide. Employment means having a job. People with disabilities should be able to apply for the same jobs as everyone else. And all people should get the same pay for the same job. If a job has benefits, all people should get the same benefits.
Donna, can you please remind us what you mean by benefits?
Sure. Benefits are some of the extras that come along with a job. Maybe the job includes health insurance, or paid vacation time, or paid sick leave. Those are all benefits. Benefits are also some of the fun things that employees get to do. Maybe your office has a softball team on the weekends. Maybe you have a company social where everybody goes to an amusement park or a picnic. Maybe you have a holiday party. Maybe you have a cafeteria that's just for employees. Those are all benefits of a job that people with disabilities have the same rights to as all other employees.
Okay, so does this mean that I can have any job I want to have if I have a disability?
Not exactly, Anne. It means that you have the right to apply for any job you are qualified for. You can't be turned away from applying just because you have a disability. Next slide, please.
So what do you mean by qualified?
Qualified means that you have the skills and experience needed to do the job. Let's talk a little bit about that. What are skills and experience? Skills are the things you need to be able to do. So maybe the job requires typing, driving, counting money.
So how do I know what skills or experience are needed for a certain job?
Usually, you'll find information about the skills and experience needed in the job announcement or advertisement. We talked a little bit about what skills are. Let's go back and talk about experience. So experience are the things you've already done. Maybe you had a similar job at another time. Maybe you have learned certain things in a special class you've taken. Maybe you have had a volunteer job where you've gained some experience working with pets, working with children, or some other thing. A job might also have requirements regarding your education or licenses. So, for example, you might see the job advertisement says that a high school diploma is required, or a college degree is required. Maybe it says you need to have a valid driving license, or a certification like a certification in a computer program, or a license in cosmetology or hairdressing. So the job announcement will tell you what kinds of skills you need to have, what kind of experience you should have, and what other education or qualifications you might need. So let's look at a couple of examples. Let's say you want to work in a coffee shop. Maybe you're not good at counting money. So that might mean you're not qualified to work at the cash register. But if you want to work in a coffee shop, you might be able to have a different kind of job there, such as serving food, serving coffee, making coffee, or even helping to cleaning up or helping restock supplies.
So you're telling me at one business, there might be some jobs that I'm qualified for and some jobs that I'm not qualified for.
That's exactly right. So sometimes when you're thinking about what kind of job you want to have, think about the kind of place you'd like to work and all of the different kinds of jobs there might be in that same employer.
Like if I like to be around children, but I'm not able to teach them, maybe I can help the teacher.
That's right. Most schools and preschools have different levels of positions. So maybe the teacher needs to have a college degree, but an aide doesn't need to have a college degree.
And I've had experience working with children, so I would look at the job description to see if
That's exactly right. So let's take that example a little bit further. Maybe the job description for a child care center talks about having skills such as being patient, being willing to work with small children, having a cheerful attitude. Those are all skills that you can bring to the job. And if you have experience working with children, maybe as a volunteer, maybe even within your own family or neighborhood, all of those experiences can help you show that you're qualified for a job. All right, next slide, please. If a person with a disability needs to do his job differently, his boss has to help. This is called a reasonable accommodation. So if you look at the first picture there on the slide, if a deaf person needs a sign language interpreter, her boss may have to provide one. And it's important to know that the ADA only applies where there are 15 workers or more. So sometimes very small businesses with just a few employees will not be able to provide reasonable accommodations. Next slide.
So can you explain a little bit more about reasonable accommodation?
Sure. A reasonable accommodation is a very important concept to understand. A reasonable accommodation is any change in the way a job is done due to a disability. But a reasonable accommodation does not change the main requirements of the job. So we'll talk about some examples.
Okay, so
Next slide.
can you talk about specific examples for people with intellectual or developmental disabilities?
Absolutely. So for one, and one that is probably pretty common, a person with an intellectual or developmental disability may have a job coach to help them learn the job. A job coach is someone who comes with you, makes sure you understand the job, maybe works with your employer to help them understand how to help you, how to communicate best with you. That's an accommodation. Another type of accommodation might be a checklist of things to do each day. Perhaps you're not good at remembering lots of different things. If you have a list in front of you that you know these are the things you're supposed to do every day, and you can check them off as you complete them, that's an accommodation.
So I know a lot of people who need checklists on their jobs, but they're not all, they don't all have intellectual and developmental disabilities. Does that mean there are accommodations that can work for people, different people with different disabilities?
That's right. Accommodations should be specific to the job and the person's needs. One person with an intellectual disability might have a really good memory and not need a checklist. Somebody else might benefit from having that. And just the same, there are plenty of people without disabilities who are not good at remembering things or staying organized, who make checklists for themselves as well. Some other types of accommodations might be extra time to complete a task. So for example, perhaps you know exactly what you need to do and you don't need any help doing it, but it just might take you a little bit longer. Let's think about maybe your job includes filing, putting documents in the right folders, and you know how to read, but maybe you read more slowly than some other people. So you might need more time to file all of the papers within the time you have for them. So that's an accommodation, having some extra time. And maybe if your job is filing and you can't read at all, your files might be color-coded. You might have red folders for one kind of document and blue folders for something else. You might have pictures that show you what items go in what boxes or on what shelves. So there are lots of different ways to think about accommodations that help people with intellectual and developmental disabilities do jobs effectively.
Now that we're in the era of apps and technology, more and more people are doing things like recording videos of them doing a task so that it's both a reinforcer that they know how to do it and a visual cue for how they can walk themselves back through it. They become their own helpers.
That's right. And frankly, technology is a benefit to everybody. How many of us use our smartphones to send us reminders, to keep our calendars, to keep notes of what we need to do? And there are lots of great apps that help people with scheduling, reminders, to-do lists, shopping lists, all kinds of things like that. Technology is a great benefit to all of us, but especially to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It gives people a great deal more independence than having someone telling you what to do.
And for people with Medicaid, devices like that can often be funded through your state's Medicaid program, which is the key benefit.
That's great to know.
Yes, really great to know. Some other accommodations which people with intellectual and developmental disabilities might benefit from is a modified break schedule depending on how long you could concentrate for. Sometimes people have a hard time with concentration for a long time, so they may need to take more frequent, shorter breaks instead of one longer break.
Well, and such an employee might also benefit from a quiet place to go if they get overloaded or overstimulated during the job. So a quiet place to go to take your break where you can regroup, settle, calm yourself down, and then go back to work is another example of an accommodation.
And another one which I think can be very helpful is on-site mentoring at the job. So if your job will appoint you, frequently this happens, a mentor to work with you, then that can be very helpful, and that certainly can be an accommodation on the job.
And can you tell our audience a little more about what you mean by a mentor? That might be a word that's unfamiliar to some of our listeners.
A mentor is a person that maybe has done the job before that you're trying to do, that can help support you and answer questions and show you how to do things. So you might have a job where you don't see your boss very much, and so the mentor would be the person you would go to ask questions and help you when you might be having any difficulty, and also support you while you're on the job.
That's great. It would be nice for everybody to have a mentor.
I know, absolutely. I was thinking the same thing. But as an accommodation, I think it can be very helpful.
Yes. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about Title II, state and local government. People with disabilities need to be treated fairly by state and local governments. People with disabilities should be able to use government programs. Being accessible means making changes so all people are included. And the ADA helps the government create programs and services that are accessible. Wow, that was a lot of information. Let's break that down a little bit. Next slide, please.
So, Donna, can you give some examples of state and local government programs and services?
Sure. Some of them are things that you probably use every day. Libraries, community centers, pools, parks, playgrounds, police stations. Maybe you don't use your police station every day, but that's an example of a government program.
So how do we make those programs so they can include everybody, including people with disabilities?
So one step is to make sure that the facilities, the buildings, the parks, the pools are accessible to people with disabilities. And that might mean, I'm sure you've all seen, ramps, elevators, curb cuts, all kinds of different ways to make a physical facility accessible. And depending on when the building was built, there are different rules about how to make the building accessible. So you might go into an older building and think, wow, this isn't very accessible, but sometimes it's the best they can do if it's an older building. Even when a building itself is not accessible, however, the government is required to make the programs accessible, and that's really important. So for example, let's say you want to take a class at your local community center, and the room where the class is taught is not accessible to you. Well, one accommodation might be for the program to be moved to another room that you can access. If we're talking about intellectual and developmental disabilities, some ways that we make programs and services accessible are by providing accommodations. So there's that word again. Some of the accommodations might be very similar to what happens on a job. Maybe you need an interpreter. Maybe you need written instructions. Maybe you need a buddy to help you in the program. Maybe...
Or extra time.
Or extra time. Maybe you just need someone to explain things to you more clearly, or more simply, or one-on-one, rather than just handing you a booklet of instructions. So there are lots of different ways that state and local government programs can be made accessible to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Some really cool accommodations we've seen on the police front are people writing up a little bit about themselves, maybe with a picture, and taking it to their police department and saying, I know you don't usually keep files on everyone in this jurisdiction, but I want all the officers in this area to know that if a call originates about me or my house, that I don't like sirens, or that I really take directions well if people speak calmly, or that I may be wearing headphones or have unusual behaviors, and those other kinds of ways to let folks know when you interact with me, I need it to be differently, and I need you to make sure everyone who could come to help me is trained on that.
Yeah, no, that, Lucy, that is a terrific thing to do, and I think it's very helpful for the police department as well. So, Donna, it sounds as if what you're saying, that the accommodations a person would need, and a person with intellectual or developmental disabilities needs on the job or to use a state or local government program, depends on that person, that individual person. So it might be different for everybody.
That's exactly right, Anne. Each person is unique, and when you put the person and the program or service together, you're going to come up with a different combination of needs every time.
So you have to take the person and then look at the program and the person and figure it out.
That's
so
right.
You might have to do it at that time
That's
that the
exactly
person
right.
wants to use the program.
One of the important government programs and services that is on everybody's mind these days is voting.
Yes.
You, as a person with an intellectual or developmental disability, have the right to vote if you're over 18. And if you need help voting, the people at your voting place need to give it to you. So maybe they need to let someone help you read the ballot. Maybe they need to show you where to put it. Maybe someone needs to help you check in. But voting is one of your rights. Let's go back to that word we learned right back at the beginning. You have a right to vote. It's a government program to run a voting place, and it needs to be accessible to you. Next slide, please. So the title of the ADA on state and local government also talks about public transportation. Public transportation includes buses, trains, or other forms of transportation that usually charges a set fare and runs on a fixed route. Public transportation must also be accessible so everyone can use it. Next slide.
So what if I can't use public transportation because of my disability?
Well, and many buses and subways and other forms of public transportation are accessible to people with disabilities. They may have ramps for wheelchairs. There might be announcements for people who can't read signs or follow along on a map. So there's a lot being done to make public transportation accessible to as many people as possible. Even so, there will be people who are not able to use public transportation due to their disabilities. So if your city or town offers public transportation, they must also provide transportation for people with disabilities. Maybe this will be a separate van that you schedule when you need to go somewhere, or a taxi that comes when you call. Here in the Washington metropolitan area, that's called Metro Access. Many of you may be familiar with that. Now, it's important to understand that you have the right to use public transportation if everyone else has it, but if your community does not provide public transportation at all, they don't have to provide it for people with disabilities either. And that can be a little bit frustrating because some other people without disabilities might have the option to drive, and maybe you don't. So that is a frustration, but the law gives you the same right as everybody else. You have the right to use public transportation if it's available in your city or town. Next slide. Okay, Title III is about public accommodations.
So, Donna, what are public accommodations?
It's a funny phrase, but public accommodations are all the places we go every day. They are places such as hotels, stores, hospitals, daycare centers. These places cannot discriminate against people with disabilities by treating them unfairly. The ADA has rules for how old buildings need to be changed to make them more accessible, and new buildings must be made accessible right from the start. Next slide.
So how can these businesses like hotels and stores and daycare centers be sure they are treating people with disabilities fairly, that they're not discriminating?
That is a great question, Anne. Treating people with intellectual disabilities fairly can include lots of things. For example, explaining things in a way that you can understand. Being patient while you count your money if it takes you longer than another customer. Speaking directly to you and not to the companion who's with you.
So it sounds like this might be different for each person depending on how their disability affects them.
That's exactly right. It's just like jobs or government services. We have to look at the individual and what your needs are and what is the service or business you want to access. So for example, if you want to eat in a restaurant and you have trouble reading a menu, you should ask the server to read it to you, or ask if they have a picture menu. Some places do. That would be an example of treating a person with a disability fairly. And when it comes time to order your meal, we hope that the server will look to you and ask you and listen to your answer and not just turn to your friend or your parent or your companion and to answer for you. businesses should treat people with disabilities with respect.
Right, and if they were talking to my friend and choosing not to talk to me, that wouldn't be very respectful.
No, because that's not the way they treat people without disabilities. When I go to a restaurant, they don't look to my companions to ask what I want to drink.
Yeah, I think they making assumptions that people with disabilities can't order food for themselves.
That's exactly right. And there are lots of different ways that businesses can treat people fairly. Patience is one of the biggest. When we're talking about people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, it might take you longer to figure out
What you want to order.
what you want to order, what you want to choose in the store, and when you get to the cash register, it might take you longer to count out your money or figure out how to use the card reader or things like that.
So it sounds like it might be a good idea for people with disabilities to kind of have in mind what they might need when they go to a place so they can tell them. And because hopefully the store will ask them, how can I help you?
Right.
Which most stores do. And it might be helpful if everybody is ready to say exactly what they need to be helped.
And that is called self-advocacy. And that is the key to all of this. If you protect your rights, you need to know what you need.
Right.
And you need to be able to ask for that, what you need, in a calm and assertive way so that people respect you and understand what you need and can help you to the best of their ability. I think that we have seen a lot of progress among the general public, a lot greater awareness of what people with disabilities need, this is the beauty of the ADA. Since it was passed, people with disabilities are out and about more in society in all the places that people without disabilities go. I think businesses, stores, restaurants, et cetera, are all getting more used to seeing customers with disabilities and learning how to serve them because, hey, these are more customers who are going to spend money in their businesses.
Exactly. And sometimes, though, the businesses don't know what to do to help. And sometimes they are a little hesitant. They stop and pause before asking. So I think it would be a great idea if people know what they need, people with and without disabilities know what they need, so they can ask and not wait necessarily to be asked.
Right, because the store owner or a business person might just not have a lot of experience with people with disabilities.
Right.
And they don't want to offend you. They want to be helpful, but they don't know what the right thing to do is. So if you can take the lead, that's great. But recognize that if you're not comfortable taking the lead, it is their obligation really to figure out how to help you best.
Exactly.
And you can communicate that lots of ways, right? You can have a companion help you call in advance and put a note on your hotel reservation file. You can have an app in your phone that helps you share what you need. You can have a written card that you would share folks if you are not comfortable or not able to speak on the spot.
There you go. Great ideas.
Those are really great ideas because I know people can get nervous or scared when talking with people they don't know, strangers.
Okay, next slide, please. Businesses must communicate with people who have hearing, visual, and or speech disabilities. Taxis, shuttle buses, and other private transportation must also follow this law. So remember, we talked about public transportation. There are also all kinds of private transportation services like Uber, Lyft. There might be private shuttle buses at a mall or amusement park. Those are all forms of transportation that must accommodate people with disabilities.
So what does this mean for someone with an intellectual disability?
So for example, a business can't require that you are accompanied by another adult if they don't require anybody else to be accompanied. Now, if you're a child and the rule in the business is that children under 18 must be accompanied by an adult, well, that applies to you too. But if you're an adult with a disability, they can't require that another adult accompany you to assist you. Rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft can't turn you away just because you have a disability. Of course, you have to be able to follow the same rules as everybody else, the same behavioral standards. You have to be able to call them on your app, just like everybody else.
But you could ask for a reasonable accommodation. For example, if Uber or Lyft usually requires people to be outside 2 minutes after their ride arrives, and maybe it takes you longer.
That's exactly right. And there's a place.
They need to know about that ahead of time, right? So they know that they need to do that.
Right. So for example, if it takes you longer to walk from your house to the sidewalk because of your disability, you can put that note in your app when you request your ride so they know that you're coming. It's just going to take a little bit longer. Same thing if you're ordering pizza and it's being delivered to the door. Maybe it's going to take you longer to get to the door. You can say that when you order your pizza. Our last example here, a restaurant can't require a driver's license to serve you alcohol if you have another form of ID. If you have a non-driver's state identification card, that should be accepted just as easily as a driver's license. And of course, they can't say, we won't serve your alcohol at all because of your disability. You have the same right to purchase alcohol as any other adult over 21.
Okay.
Next slide. Title IV deals with telecommunications. Telecommunications include using the telephone system. A telecommunications relay service, also known as TRS or relay service, is an operator-assisted service that allows people with hearing or speech disabilities to make calls using text-based devices or using sign language with video equipment. The ADA says that phone companies must be able to help people with hearing and speech disabilities make phone calls. Next slide.
So what does this mean?
Well, this talks about telephone services for people who are deaf. When the ADA was written 30 years ago, it was very difficult for people with hearing or speech disabilities to communicate by phone. Today, newer technology makes this less important. Just think, 30 years ago, there were no cell phones, there were no computers for everyday use,
No live video chatting.
no live video chatting, no Skype, no FaceTime. All of those services now help people with disabilities communicate far more effectively than they were able to when the ADA was first written.
I spoke with someone recently who said they used their telephone relay service to join a webinar because they joined at the last minute and didn't think to ask ahead for captioning accommodations, but were able to use their relay service to get it live captioned or live signed for them.
Oh, that's great.
And so it's just another way to use it to join events and conferences like everybody else, even if you haven't asked ahead for an accommodation.
Correct.
That's called creative thinking.
Yeah.
Very well done.
Next slide. Also, under the ADA, government messages on television must have closed captioning. Closed captioning means that all words must also be written so people can read what is said. And that there's a great example going on right now. I mean, we're all seeing government announcements every day about coronavirus. And when you see governors and emergency management officials talking on your television screen, you will probably see a sign language interpreter next to them and captioning across the bottom of the screen so that people with hearing or speech disabilities can understand as well. These are important messages. Next slide. Title V, Miscellaneous. Miscellaneous means a mix of different things. All the other things that don't fit into one of the other titles. Next slide. So a few people may not like the ADA, but they can't blame or hurt people with disabilities. It is against the law for anyone to try to stop people with disabilities from doing things like riding the bus, going to restaurants, voting, working at their jobs, or other things that they have the right to do. Next slide.
Donna, can you tell us what retaliation means?
Retaliation means to do something harmful to someone because that person tried to stand up for their rights. So for example, under the ADA, if a person with a disability asks for a reasonable accommodation at work and the manager fires them, that's retaliation. And it's against the law.
So where can I call for more information, Donna?
The ADA Information Center has a nationwide network. There are regional ADA centers throughout the country based on where you live. There's an 800 number that you can call to be connected with the ADA center in your region. That's 800-949-4232, or you can go online to adainfo.org.
And I will say that if you go to www.adainfo.org, you will find the overview to employment in booklet format and in PowerPoint format available right there on the front page for you if you would like to use it. We also anticipate coming out with another document called the ADA and Working that talks a lot about reasonable accommodation.
Next slide, please. So if you want to know more about the ADA as it applies to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, please check out the other 3 webinars in this series. They are all on the ARC of Northern Virginia's YouTube site. We also have a brand new booklet on the ADA. There's a picture of the cover right there. You can download it from the ADA info website, and there are paper copies available at the ARC of Northern Virginia. It will be very similar to this webinar we've just had, but nice in a nice little portable booklet for you.
Here's an interesting question we got from someone in a workshop last week, actually, about supported decision making. And they said, so what if someone does violate my rights under the ADA? Can I sue them for lots of money?
And the answer is no. So
that's a good question, though.
It is a good question. Lots of companies, especially larger companies, and government programs and services probably have some sort of an internal complaint process, and that's usually the best way to start. So for example, if my boss fires me because I asked for a reasonable accommodation, I might go to the Human Resources office or to his supervisor to make my complaint and see if someone will resolve that problem for me. If you don't get any success trying to work it out within your organization or within the agency or the program, you can contact the United States Equal Opportunity, well, if it's a job, you contact the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. If you feel you are being discriminated against on the basis of your disability in other areas, for example, in a government program or service, complaints are handled by the United States Department of Justice. But in either case, you don't get money damages unless, for example, let's say you were fired when you asked for a reasonable accommodation and you decide to file a lawsuit, you might get damages like back pay if it's determined that, if the court decides that it was wrong to fire you, they should have helped you get an accommodation to do the job. The court might say you're entitled to the pay you lost for being fired. But in general, when you try to enforce your rights under the ADA, the government's response is going to be to fix it, to make that company or agency or program do a better job for everybody else going forward.
It's like, that's the great attitude you want to have when you raise an ADA concern, right? You're trying to help a business or your employer or a government agency do better.
Right.
So you're going in to say, I want to help you so we can work together, not usually, you've done everything wrong.
Right.
You need to fix this all for me.
Right, and even after 30 years, because we're coming up this July on the 30th anniversary of the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's still a lot of people who don't know about the ADA, and even if they know about it, they don't know what it says. So all of us have the opportunity to really educate people about the ADA. And even if you don't know the answer to somebody's question, you have the 800 number that you can give to anybody to tell them, and you can tell them that they can ask any question they want about the ADA, and they can get an answer by calling the 800-949-4232. And you dial that anywhere in the country, and you get connected to the ADA center that serves that particular location that you're calling from. So it's a great resource for you to have and for you to use to help educate people about the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Next slide. And the last slide was just some of these resources again, adainfo.org. The Mid-Atlantic ADA Center is a project of Transcend Incorporated, www.transcend.org. And if you're outside the Mid-Atlantic region, adata.org, that's ADA Technical Assistance.org. Do we have any other questions?
For folks joining us on a webinar, feel free to send in your questions on the chat feature or the Q&A feature, and we'll work through them here in the room. We'll read your questions anonymously. The first question is, this information is extremely valuable. Can we get this afterward through a link? Yes, absolutely. Anyone who signed up will receive the recording and the slides for this presentation. If you're listening to this recording after the fact on the ARC of Northern Virginia's YouTube channel, know that the 3 previous webinars in this series are also on that channel, and you can contact the ARC of Northern Virginia anytime if you wanted to see copies of the slides or if you had any other questions. And again, the information shared about ADA info and the 800 number are other great resources to contact if you have questions about listening to this in the future.
And I really want to encourage people who have questions about the law to contact us at the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, because that's what we do. We are funded by the government to answer people's questions. So we answer employers' questions, we answer people with disabilities questions, we answer a lot of state and local government program questions as well.
All right, so we got a first question about, for public areas in an apartment complex, like the leasing office, does the ADA apply?
Yes. The leasing area of the apartment complex must be accessible to people with disabilities. Now, remember what I said about different buildings might have different rules for accessibility based on when they were built. So if the building is very old and it's not possible to make the leasing office physically accessible, the leasing agent must be able to meet with you somewhere that is accessible to you. And that's where we're talking about physical accessibility. The people who work in a leasing office need to provide whatever accommodations you need to be able to communicate with them, understand what your options are, whether that's talking to you about the lease, showing you the sample apartments, or answering whatever questions you have.
And that's a great question, Donna, and because the ADA doesn't apply to the actual apartment units. That's another law called the Fair Housing Act. So sometimes the different laws that protect people with disabilities can overlap a little bit, and cause some questions too, which again, we're happy to answer.
But the leasing office of an apartment complex is an example of a public accommodation that we talked about, all those private businesses.
So the next question, it may be too complicated to answer here, but maybe we can direct them to some resources. So there's an area where there's a private gated community and the sidewalk ends abruptly inside that community. They are trying to connect the sidewalk to make it contiguous and accessible, but there's an AT&T phone box in the middle of the sidewalk. So they've been asking AT&T to move that, they said, for several years. Would the ADA theoretically govern an issue like this, and where should they go for more information?
I can't answer that. I'm not so sure, because you're talking about
A residential area,
private property.
but depending on where the sidewalk is as well. So that is a question that I would absolutely call our 800 number, because we have technical assistance specialists who can answer the question, and if they don't have the answer right away, they can research it and get back to you with the correct answer.
So the next question was, I'm having trouble seeing the closed captions. And so our captioner had actually at the beginning of the webinar sent out the link to the captions in the chat section. So hopefully you were able to see them there. Okay, how about parking lots of an apartment complex subject to ADA, Fair Housing Act, or both?
I honestly don't know. There are standards written by the Access Board that talk about lots of physical facility requirements. I am not an expert on those issues. I can't say for sure.
Yeah, and again, I would recommend calling our office. I would say logically that the spaces that are relegated that are assigned to the leasing office have to be accessible, and the spaces that are assigned to the different apartments are subject to the requirements of the Fair Housing Act.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I don't know what the details are, but I'm sure there are standards.
Okay, so if we have a senior citizen apartment building that has a waiver for mobility impairment for people under 62, so meaning if you're under 62, you could theoretically live there, then there are 10 apartments for this group, and a lot of times people under age 62 want to look at standard apartments. So this is more of a Fair Housing Act question, actually.
Well, and again, I would encourage anybody with this amount of detail questions to contact the ADA Center, the 800 number, and we can talk through, because the questions usually lead to more questions as well.
That's a great.
If there are any general questions about the content that we covered today, we'd be happy to entertain them.
And got a great one. So what is the Access Board?
The Access Board is a government agency that writes regulations for the ADA. Things that are very specific, like how wide does a door have to be and how high does a counter have to be, things like that. Very, very technical.
And they create all the rules when it comes to the physical access requirements of the ADA. And they have a great website too, which has a lot of interesting pictures and three-dimensional pictures, so you can get an idea of.
I have even just typed a question into a search engine to say how wide does the doorway have to be for wheelchair access, and you'll get a link to the Access Board. So their website is online, easily searchable.
So there's notes here about some places where the ADA really does struggle to keep up with meeting needs, especially for people with visual impairments. And I would say there's no question about that. Always kind of on a case-by-case basis, you'll ask for your reasonable accommodation, and you can go to the ADA Info Center to get more help.
Well, and that brings up a good point, Lucy, because, you know, it has been 30 years, and it is always surprising how many people still don't know about the ADA. And so, again, it is incumbent upon us to educate these people and to help them get access to the resources they need to become accessible. So I think we're all in this together in doing that.
This very much gets to that, and what a brilliant question. Is there a year in which all public places of accommodation need to be ADA accessible?
Now. Now. And again, very disappointing, 30 years later. And you know, especially when you look at physical access and things that are relatively easy and obvious to do. And again, it goes back to we are funded to educate people. So please send, if you see inaccessible locations, if you have questions about, if the businesses have questions, send them to us, because that's what we're here for. And you know, we're not going out of business anytime soon, unfortunately.
And remember, even if a building is not physically accessible, or every single space within the building is not physically accessible, the programs and services that are offered must be accessible.
Right.
So there was a clarification there that there was no safe harbor date for businesses. Now that the law is 30 years old, all of those timelines have lapsed.
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, like we've discussed today, that doesn't necessarily mean a business fully understood the implications of the law and has implemented it perfectly, but it does mean that they need to be making all those accommodations to make places accessible for folks now. And it's time to work together with them if we're finding barriers to access.
Right. And I will say one more additional piece of information that people might not know. When it comes to state and local governments, the Title II section of this law requirement, there is a lot of work that these local and state governments need to do to make their programs accessible. And they will be the first to tell you they're getting no extra money from any source to make these changes, to make it happen. They still need to do it. They know that, there's no question. However, it can be difficult, so they have to prioritize different measures that they take, and a lot of them are trying very, very hard to do that. I will say we've seen that quite a bit, and they're working on it. Again, educating is really important, and we know the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
That's exactly it, right? If they're going to prioritize, they're going to prioritize what they know a customer or someone attending wants or has asked for.
Exactly.
So it's all the more important to make that request, even if you know it cannot be immediately honored and you're going to have to work on it.
Well, thank you so much, Lucy. Thank you, Donna. This has been wonderful to work with you guys on this series, and we hope to do more webinars in the future.
If you have specific things you'd like to hear about, please let us know.
All right. So again, everyone will be getting a copy of these slides. So here's some more information on Contact for Transcend, the home of our Mid-Atlantic ADA Resource Center. Thanks again for them loaning Ann to us to help with these presentations. Thank you all very much. Look for this presentation online and have a fantastic